Hey everyone, welcome into our security discussion. Today we have with us Stas, Dan, and Will to go over, I think, a really interesting topic. I'm seeing a lot of chatter on LinkedIn from some industry professionals. This idea of is compliance equal to security? Which comes first? Is this a chicken and egg kind of exercise? So I figured the best way to do this was bringing in some experts in this space. Let's talk about it. Let's dig into it. And let's kind of understand from a tactical perspective, when an organization is kind of looking to tackle compliance or tackle security, what are some methodologies, what are some frameworks, some ideas that they should be thinking? And if they don't have the resources internally, where are some areas that they could go to kind of find some of those answers? So before we jump into this, Dan, maybe just tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're coming from, and then we'll pass it off to Will. Stash, you could wrap it up, and we'll jump right into our conversation.
Absolutely. Thanks for the invite. Really excited to be here and talk about this awesome topic. Dan Didier, I'm the Vice President of Solution Engineering at Grey Castle Security. Grey Castle Security focuses on GRC, cyber operations, privacy, and incident response. So we're really full service cyber firm. At the core, we do believe that risk and risk management is what should drive all of your cyber activities, your spend, your focus, your priorities, and how you get aligned. Whether it's a pen test, a vulnerability assessment, or an actual risk assessment itself, that's always where we start. So that's what I've been doing for 20 plus years now. I've been at Grey Castle since 2014.
Will Klusovsky. So I've been doing cybersecurity technology for 24 years now, I think is what it is at. In that time, I've worked the majority of that time in consulting organizations and managed services organizations, and pretty much within every department that exists. So, I've been a consultant and delivered. I've built practice areas. I've done R&D. I've done, product management, program management, product development, general, operations management, all this stuff. So, pretty wide verse experience there. Currently working at Stratascale, which is an SHI company, where we have, again, end-to-end security capabilities from the strategy to the technology to the managed services capabilities.
Thanks, Will. Thanks for being here. And Stas?
Yeah, my name is Stas Bajuka. I'm the CEO and founder of Compyl. We're an information security automation platform, essentially next-gen GRC. We help customers lay down fundamentals in their organization. We, just similar to Dan, we focus on risk and mitigating risk for our customers and making sure that their foundations stay in place and that we can build on top of them, essentially giving them a platform that's easy to use, easy to scale, and they can pick and choose what they want from it. My personal background is I've been in the security space for 20 plus years as well. I've got pretty much every accreditation in this space, and predominantly I've been working in financial services before this as a CISO multiple times.
I kind of want to start from the beginning. And in my mind, when I think of the beginning of this kind of journey that companies go on, is this whole idea that I think in early stage companies, as they're growing, compliance becomes a deal stopper. And it becomes something that organizations need to fix. They need to find solutions. But oftentimes those solutions end up being more of like a checkbox exercise than formally kind of following those compliance framework standards to de-risk the organization and to put them in a more secure point than they were yesterday. So Stas, if you wouldn't mind, maybe talk to me a little bit about kind of your experience when you're you've worked with and consulted with a lot of organizations. This idea of compliance being a checkbox exercise, why is that a risk? Why is that an issue? Or how should companies kind of fundamentally maybe make a shift in thinking about that?
Generally, starting with a framework is generally a good idea, especially if you're new to the space or you've never done it before. A framework generally helps you lay out the things that you need to do as an organization. The problem with just focusing on compliance or just getting an accreditation like SOC 2 or ISO, whatever it is there's multiple problems with both of them. One is a report. It can be you decide what domains you want to follow, you decide what controls look like, and then you basically tell the auditor to rate you on this or that. Where what companies need to focus on is actually just getting the fundamentals right for their organization and the security and the security around it. If you look at all of the main like if you look at all of the latest breaches, the vast majority of them are still happening for for very basic things like not having MFA enabled, not having proper policies, and people acknowledging what those policies are and what they say. Business email compromise. Like it's all things that should have been dealt with and resolved a number of years ago, if not decades ago, and we should be moving on to the cooler things like XDR and EDR. But those things are great, but if all of those things are disjointed and nobody's actually looking at any of the any of the SIEM reports or any of the analytics that are coming off the back of anomaly detection, then that's all just bells and whistles. But the fundamentals have to be there, and if the fundamentals are there, you build on it and you get compliance naturally. There's some lifts that you have to make depending on what the compliance standard is and what you're trying to do. But generally, if you have the fundamentals in place, all that other stuff should come pretty easily.
Dan, I'm curious from your end. I mean, you've had your hands in this for quite a while too. Probably working with organizations varying in sizes, maybe, and kind of security maturity levels. The idea of like this compliance being a checkbox exercise. How do you kind of think of that? Or when you cross that bridge with an organization, how do you kind of help them shift how they're approaching that kind of solve?
That notion of checkbox is heavily ingrained, more or less, depending on the industry you go to. And I'm not picking on anyone, but it really becomes a legal issue, especially for those more mature, like finance. I'll be, let's be open here. Did we comply? Yes or no? And that really kind of chips away at my heart as a security practitioner who wants to make the most possible impact and improve our security reasonably. So the biggest thing you can do, though, and this is what I've found over and over again, is there is a massive disconnect between the folks who own the risk at the organization, who make all the decisions on where to invest, what to do as far as budgeting, resources, and the people that are responsible for cybersecurity. And the biggest thing that you can do is get those stakeholders on the same page, get them to actually. So imagine if I walk into a room as the CFO, the CEO, or anyone at that leadership level, and a bunch of nerdy guys, like on this call, sorry guys, start talking about three-letter like VPNs and triple DES and MFA. I immediately say, this is a waste of my time. I don't know what the heck is going on here. What's the minimum you guys need to do? That's what happens. Now, if you can shift that mindset and get those folks to feel like they understand what cybersecurity is, that's the key. Because now they can make informed decisions about what to do or not to do. And you have to elevate it above the bits and bytes. So we can talk more about how we can do that. And I'm happy to jump in. I don't want to steal anyone's thunder, but really for me, the most important thing is to turn this into a risk-based conversation. If I can agree that we have a problem, a vulnerability, and there are threats, and we can do some pretty simple math to say how likely we are to be impacted, right? Because there's all this data out there. Verizon data breach report just came out for 2023, right? And to Stas's point, it's all the same old stuff. I think the stat today, or at least recently, of how much MFA has been deployed in the big three, Azure, Google, and Amazon, is like 28%. Okay. So there's one of your big problems, and then the whole phishing issue, the business email compromises, right? But when we're talking at the lower bits and bytes level and not elevating it to a business risk conversation, that's where it all just goes away. So for me, it's being very, very pointed, very specific, and not confusing anybody, and bringing that conversation up to a level that the business can digest, and then ask smart questions and make decisions. I don't know if we can go into some examples there, but
I was gonna say, it's funny because I just did another podcast with Alan Alford on a tangential topic, because what you just said is so what Dan just said was, it depends on the industry and the organization. And historically, and I mean back in the day, we're all, probably we're all older than most at this point, right? You know, when compliance frameworks came out, there were organizations. I worked for multi-billion-dollar company that didn't have a CISO, right? And didn't have security. And one of my first forays into that was, oh, we need to be PCI compliant. And for them, that was, you know, because they had to do it. You know, VNC had to be taken out, and you couldn't use Telnet and all this other stuff, right? So to Dan's point, I think we're at a position now where we have a bunch of CISOs who have kind of grown up in that world, and you know, there should be a large, like a good CISO knows that their job is to go around and sell security to the rest of the business, right? That's really what that's one of the key things they need to be doing is, hey, here's why we need to do this. And, you know, I've advised a lot of organizations in my time, when you have compliance requirements, take advantage of that, because that money has to come in. You know, you've got something that's telling you you need to do this because the business, you know, we're not going to let the business function if you don't. That's an opportunity to go, okay, great, let's make some improvements. Let's take advantage of that. Let's, you know, if we don't have a framework or we don't have a roadmap, well, okay, let's, you know, let's pretend it's 2008 and PCI came out and now we need a PCI roadmap. Well, let's make it a security roadmap, right? Because now we have everybody's attention. So now we can play on it. And so I think that whole idea of, yeah, there are a lot of organizations that are looking at, oh, I just need to do this. I want to check the box and be done with it. And that's fine. And, but, you know, those who have the right leadership that understand, okay, we need to make security a priority, you know, they know that that's their job, I think.
I think that's really well said. I mean, I can just jump into this. Like, Dan, what you said about, you know, managing risk, I think it's like, there's three things that I usually, whenever I go into a new organization, we start a new contract, like, can I see your policies? Can I see an architectural diagram? And can I see your risk register? Chances are they don't have any of those. But you know, in order to be able to get the business to really care about what it is that they're, to get them to pay attention to security, if you can quantify the risk in a way that it isn't bits, and it is really, this is what the impact is to the organization, this is what the inherent risk, the residual risk, and this is the actual dollar amount that's going to impact you guys, and these are the actual consequences of it, like then they tend to care, and then they start to pay attention. I don't know if that's where you were going to go with this. I assume it's going to be something similar.
100%, because here's the deal, like, this is what's this is what the secret sauce is for folks that are going to listen to this or try to understand how to elevate the cybersecurity conversation. Is me, I have no idea what the impact to the business is. I don't own the finances. I don't own the operations. I don't understand the revenue streams, but I do know what the potential vulnerabilities are and how likely they are to occur and what assets they could impact. Then I just have a simple conversation with director of operations or with the CFO in the room and say, hey, if these systems go down, which, by the way, based on our experience, is you got a 50% probability in the next year that you lose these things for 3 to 5 days. What does that cost the organization? They will be able to throw a number at you in seconds. And then they're going to ask a bunch of follow-up questions like, oh, would this be impacted too? And what about this? And now those individuals feel like they understand cybersecurity because you didn't make an assumption. You didn't jump up and down and start yelling about all the things that could go wrong that they don't understand. You asked them, what's the impact of the business? You just brought your insight where you are the expert. Let them bring their expertise to the table, come together. And when you leave that room, when you go through a risk workshop with leadership and you bring that sort of an approach, they leave saying, I now know what cybersecurity is. And I know what the top 5 things that we need to do are. I know how much money I've got. Let's figure out how to best spend that money on those 5 things. So you just made them, I don't want to say cybersecurity experts, but you made them cyber comfortable, which is very rare in today's day and age. And you just got them on your bandwagon. So it might all started with compliance, but to Will's point and to Stas, to your point about this needs to get elevated and we need to do something more with this. In my experience, that's the way to do it. And then, you know, you've got some goodwill at that point. you need to go away and take that risk register and create a corrective action plan, right? Because that's the next thing that I ask for, Stas, is all right, what have you done about it? And that's what, by the way, that's what an auditor or a regulator is going to ask you if you have an issue. It's, okay, you guys knew you had risks. Did you do anything about it? But
We accepted it.
Well,
if there's a record of that happening.
So that's another thing that I would love to bring up and talk about here. But if you confused everyone in the process, it's not likely you're going to get any action if everyone's confused, right? So really, by breaking down these barriers, that's where we become successful. And one little thing, I kind of get on a roll here, guys, and I'll throw it to you, Will. Here's what I find interesting. This is like your head explodes sometimes, because the folks that are in cyber up to their neck or sometimes over, you're in your own little world sometimes. And the folks in IT, same deal. When you're not in our world, you have to realize some things. When I go into a risk workshop and to conduct this sort of activity, the first thing I do is at an elementary level define, because the organization probably hasn't done a good job of this. What is a high risk? What is a moderate risk? What is a low risk? And the reality is people they just jump in and say, well, do you think this is a high risk? And everyone goes, well,
Yeah,
maybe.
Yeah.
It could be, could this occur sometime in the next, and then the other problem is they say, well, how likely is this to occur? Well, in my mind, the default is 1 year, we can't think further year. Someone might be saying, oh, in the next 10 years? Yeah, very likely. So if you don't define your levels for likelihood and what they mean and risk, you are going to have the most unsuccessful activity ever. And everyone's going to be really upset when they leave that thing. In fact, those senior folks are probably going to leave early because they're going to see this as a waste of their time. However, if you came back and said, hey, we've tentatively or initially defined, because they didn't have risk methodology, a high risk as something that's likely to impact one or more systems for somewhere between, up to 5 days of an outage that could lead to significant financial and reputational loss. Okay, now I have some benchmarks here. And if you want to define critical is you're likely to go out of business. So we don't just throw critical out there, right? And then you go down to moderate and low. Now you've got everyone on the same field, right? Low would be what? A very minor impact to the business, difficult to measure financially or reputationally, right? If you start off like that and get these things defined for both the likelihood and then the impact side of the house, you can now have a very effective conversation because everyone can bring their knowledge to the table. So, I'll throw it back to you, Will. I'm sure you've probably been part of a conversation where these things haven't been defined and people are all over the map, right? I wonder if you have any other thoughts or experiences there.
Yeah, it's interesting because, and we're kind of moving into the risk conversation, which is great. I love that. But, at the end of the day, you've got to, you're talking finances. You have to talk and everywhere I've ever been and every client I've ever talked to, my mantra is always like, everybody needs to understand everyone's job is to help the person above them, right? And the company has a mission and a goal. And if everything you're doing doesn't help achieve that goal, then what you're doing is not beneficial. So from a security perspective, compliance is good because we have to do it. And security people see it as a way to get things in. But I constantly am sort of advising, especially newer people getting into the industry who just like, oh, you need to have this, you need to have all these controls, you need to do all these things. I was like, no, you don't. You need to evaluate it. And you need to find out what the actual, at the end of the day, financial impact is to it, right? You get a lot of people who think, like you can't do security for security's sake, right? And if you need to do it for compliance sake, guess what? There's things like compensating controls, right? Oh, I don't meet this requirement, but because of A, B, C, and D and the way that we do business, this is really low risk and we don't need it, right? And auditors can understand that. And if you can bring that to them. So I think that's kind of where I get like, one, you need to bring that, you need to understand that it's all about the business. People get kind of caught up in, there's, like you said, everybody gets heads down into their world of security or IT or whatever it is. And they want to do the things they want to do. But at the end of the day, your job is to make widgets or do whatever, right? And I can, for an example, like in the OT space, when OT security started coming out, I was, flabbergasted, and I actually got to do a lot of R&D work in that and really saw that grow up. And it was blown away by, because everybody on the security side was like, well, you have to patch, you have to patch, you have to patch. And, ICS systems and OT systems are like, no, don't touch it. Because if you patch it and it breaks, operations go down, and one day of not producing something could be critical, right? So in that case, yeah, no, that's not a high risk, especially. And then if you can quantify, well, let's put some compensating controls into it. Let's do some other things to make sure it's air gap. Let's test around the system, right? So it's not always, I think that's where, when we talk about compliance, having someone understand the intent of that regulation or that requirement is very, very important, versus just being like, oh yeah, you have, like, taking it word for word and being like, you have to do this. That's why I think like ISO and NIST, which are not, I mean, you can be compliant with that framework, but it's not a compliance framework. It's not PCI or SOC or whatever, right? Those are meant to guide you on best practices and what to do and how to do things properly, where the other things are more prescriptive, but you have to understand the intent of those. So, and that intent is, what's the criticality?
Let's just say this: ISO 27001 is a information security management system. It doesn't prescribe a minimum level of security, and the auditors, once you're implemented, what they check on is that you're improving. Are we improving this much, or this much? Like, it doesn't matter, you're improving, so you're meeting the intent. So it's up to you, it's up to the organization, like you said, Will. And I think there was just you might have been on it, Will, I don't know, there was a thread on LinkedIn I was just reading, like someone asked the same question, like, what, compliance or security? And it was like,
oh no, yeah, no, I do know. In fact, I was thinking about that before we joined this, and I was like, if you're compliant with your company's security framework, then yes, compliance equals security. Because if you've properly defined how your organization is going to work, then you need to be compliant with it. Right. But if you're PCI compliant or SOC 2 compliant, that doesn't mean you're secure.
I think like what
also, who's auditing you? How much do they know?
I think what I'm hearing, and please correct me if maybe I'm misstating this, but like, I think, if you were to go back 10, 15 years and you're thinking of the guy trying to, say, we're at risk, and, throwing these 3-letter acronyms around and so on and so forth. But, fast forward to 2023, I think like it's imperative, if you're owning compliance or security, and I know these are broad topics, but like within an organization, it's becoming really almost, a major requirement to be able to properly communicate in a way that the business is going to be able to digest and then be able to make decisions based on what you're communicating. And I think, Stas, sometimes what we see with organizations is it's very hard to get there, but when you can make security and foster that in an organization and it becomes part of their culture, security is no longer looked at as that's slowing down business. It's actually looked at as something that can move business along and help you make decisions quicker and in a more secure way. But getting there is easier said than done.
This is all about having well-defined processes and people knowing what those processes are and making them as simple as possible to use. Just going back of both Dan and Will's point, like I had a new CISO approach me at a conference, and he was basically saying, oh, like I tried to implement this new risk management program in the organization. We don't have anything in place at the moment. And I showed it to the CFO, and she had no idea what I was talking about. And I'm like, well, what did you do? And then he was like, well, I showed her the policy. And I was like, did you walk her through the policy? And then he's like, no. And I'm like, well, she's not going to know what a 5x5 like heat map grid is, nor will she give a shit, nor will she care,
right.
What that is and how it works. And like, so I sent him a deck that I used in the past, where it's just basically, it's supposed to be an interactive deck where you have the right people in the room. You explain, just like what Dan was saying, like, all right, here's your likelihood. Often doesn't change very often. You use it on a 1-year scale. But impact, how do you guys rate impact on this? What is the dollar amount here? What is it? Is it reputational risk? The client loss? What are you guys, how do you guys want to quantify this? And then once you actually have that level playing field, you can actually start quantifying. All that risk and making it really valuable to the organization. But also, like, my experience with this has been other departments or like other teams all want to report risk as well, because like it makes it easier for them to not have to do something that a client is asking them to do that makes absolutely no sense, and they just have no way of being able to say this makes no sense in a way that the business will understand, and this gives them that out. And that's also happened in my experience quite a bit as well.
You bring up an excellent point that I see all the time. And so I'll frame it right. I think everybody who works for a company like kind of understands financial risk and risk to the business, right? They understand, oh, if I do this, or there's certain things that if I do during my day, like, oh, that's just well aware that's a bad thing to do, but they don't necessarily understand security risk. Like it's that whole contextual thing, right? Everybody thinks I'm not important, it doesn't matter. So if I do something wrong, who cares? If they get my little bit of information. And I see this all the time with data protection specifically. Because everybody knows that it's a problem and they want to implement the technology, but they don't want to do the organizational change management, right? So all of us here and most people listening to it are going to understand that if I have a DLP solution, I can flag emails, I can route things differently, I can control people's access to different systems and what they can and can't do. I'm going to be labeling stuff, and there's policy, all of this stuff makes total sense to everybody in security. But if you're an admin in the real estate part of the organization, and you go to get access to some data and they tell you no, you can't have it, or you try to send an email and it says no, you can't do that, and nobody's explained to them why they can't, they're going to escalate, they're going to get mad, and then you're going to have a battle of the titans at the top, and then security's going to lose because you didn't do the right things at the front. You have to educate the organization on why you're doing these things. Because hey, this is GDPR requirement, this is CCPA requirement, this is PCI, whatever it is, right? And understand your business line does this. Again, going back to the CISO and sort of all that executive leadership team, that's their role, is to make sure that everybody understands that when we're talking about compliance and security, here's how it affects the business and why you need to care, right?
For sure. And it's all about the reasonable level of security as well, which is what Dan hinted at as well. Because like the amount of times that I've seen like companies do something and they take it to the absolute extreme. Your DLP example is perfect, right? Lock down absolutely everything, and yet
nobody can do any work.
or exactly, or all of the domain admins have never passwords never expire, and they all have email addresses associated with them, right? Like, I don't know. It's just about the reasonable level of security.
Yeah.
I'll give you a good client example I've had, and anybody can steal this. And when they told me this at first, as a security professional, I was like, well, that, okay. Well, I'll just give you, here's the situation, right? So I had a client who was in an industry, I won't name their industry. And what they did is they would use maturity scoring against another industry, like a higher, like let's say pharmaceutical, right, industry, which is something. And then they created their risk plan based on that. So they wanted their maturity scoring to be higher than like the average pharmaceutical company was, even though they weren't in pharmaceutical. The whole idea was if and when something happened and somebody came down to give them fines, they were legally defensible, because they can go and say, look, in our industry, we're crushing it. And compared to this industry, who should be even doing better, we're even doing better than they are in most areas. So our due diligence is checkbox. So it goes back to what Dan said earlier about a lot of times this gets tied up with legal and business. So that risk prioritization in their case wasn't necessarily focused on, well, let's do a bunch of threat modeling and see where the biggest attacks are and where we want to invest our money, but more of like, hey, what do we need to do to make sure that if something happens, we don't lose more money?
I think a lot of what's being discussed here is like just tying it back to revenue, potential loss of revenue, because that changes the conversation. It makes the conversation, I think, a little more tangible for the non-technical folk at the table to just be able to digest what it is we're doing, right? Because when security is only seen as a cost center and slowing business down, pretty soon those security folk, they don't get invited to those meetings anymore, right? And that's a problem. That's truly a problem. So That's great. Well, listen, I appreciate the three of you making time for this today. This was awesome. And certainly an engaging conversation. I'm sure we're going to get a lot of people that are going to be asking some questions, and that's always good. But I wanted to really thank you one last time, and look forward to having you guys on another security sessions panel discussion. This was great. Will, Stas, Dan, thank you, and until next time.